In terms of the counterculture, I mean, the best way to distill it is there's a brilliant Norman O'Brien quote where he says that the ego is the first private property. The whole drive of the whole culture, from LSD through all the different techniques of meditation, the way that yoga was used, everything is all directed to this thing of ego dissolution. And at this point, these theorists, they're quintessentially theorists of the self. And what they were entranced by with Freud, most especially, was the idea of liberation and sexual liberation.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today we speak with Matthew Ingram, author of Retreat, How the Counterculture Invented Wellness. Together we chatted about a host of topics, including Allen Ginsberg, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Thunder Tour Bus, Stan Grof, LSD psychotherapy, the Prague Spring, psychoanalysis, Freudian Marxism, ego dissolution, the CIA, MK Ultra, Tom Wolfe, Libertarians, cultural revolt, and more. Matthew Ingram, thanks so much for joining us today on Voices of Esalen.
Thanks very much for having me along, Sam.
Your book is Retreat, How the Counterculture Invented Wellness. It's a really fascinating read. It's so fun. It has an encyclopedic kind of take on the counterculture, on everything that people care about, the hippies, the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, beyond. I want to ask you, what's the basic thesis of this book? Why is wellness and the wellness industry interesting to you at this historical moment?
Well, certainly I came at it, the subject, through an interest in the counterculture and music. From that, I found a lot of the things that would have interested me as a sort of a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old around the counterculture were musical. But as I researched it deeper and became more familiar with it, I found that really a lot of those things that I was familiar with were actually had their roots in deeper things, in meditation, in yoga, in the psychedelic experience, and in food. And so my interest wandered. And I think I've noticed that happen certainly in the festival culture in the UK as well. We have a lot more wellness festivals, which is it's a kind of shift between what would have once been a music festival is now a wellness festival. So I guess I'm sort of part of that demographic that probably is experiencing a shift in interest.
Yeah. I have this question for you. You know, what's your background as it pertained to the counterculture? Having grown up in Britain, was your experience and I think other people's experience of the counterculture akin to that of an American's? And sort of, contained within this question is the idea: was the UK having a countercultural experience on the same timeline as in the US?
I think definitely. I mean, I think certainly just to look at my record collection, I have the 60s and 70s. I have a UK section and an American section, but for the 60s, I have a UK section and an American section. And then for the 70s, I have a rock section. So, it's like, certainly there was a sort of a mutual love affair after the Beatles between the two cultures. But certainly growing up, and following these things through the music scene, that sense of the counterculture was still there very strongly, certainly in the music journalism of the 80s. It was always this sort of ghost-like presence in the background of the counterculture. And then we had sort of what I would class as very strong returns. So the 90s and acid house in the UK, which was very much a very strong phenomenon. That was extremely like a second coming of those ideas, and indeed the same sort of people gained a second currency. So Leary was omnipresent in the 90s when I was raving, and all those ideas. You suddenly have documentaries about the merry pranksters being made, and obviously LSD was very current at that time. So for a long stretch, I think right the way through to about 96, we had what I would call a kind of very long 60s. And I think that experience certainly towers with my recollection of what it was like to visit America and the preoccupations of my American friends, and how that journalism, that ethos was sort of fundamental to how we all grew up. Whether it's the same now, I'm not so sure. But as I say, those ideas of mutated, and we find them in different places, perhaps.
Now, I'm going to go right for the meat of this book in respect to some stuff that's interesting to me. And I thought it might be fun for over the course of this interview for me just to kind of pepper you with questions and for you to just, respond and tell us all about the stuff that's inside of this book. Because really, this book has just got like a laundry list of the cast and characters and the concerns of the counterculture. So talk to me a little bit about, you found it relevant to focus on Stan Grof, right? And he's thought of as the godfather of LSD psychotherapy. Talk to me a little bit about Stan Grof and why you felt he was important.
Well, Stan is my experience of interviewing Stan. I actually interviewed Stan quite early on in the process, but at each point I would interview people afterwards. They were kind of stunned and overwhelmed that I had actually spoken to him. And so my kind of the estimation of him, my understanding of him grew progressively through the book until by the end of it was like, oh my God, I had the opportunity to, sit down and talk to him. It actually, in some senses, he's not an obviously countercultural person. I think it's something that he downplays. I think he's always had to stay. He's played a very clever political game with the establishment. He's always managed to keep his show on the road where a lot of people have gone by the wayside. And I think part of the way that he's done that is to very cleverly not overemphasize certain aspects and the kind of the rebellious aspects or the transformative aspects or the aspects of what he does which are threatening to the status quo, which is very much the counterculture's message. So, but I think those are there in spades. I think that, I've heard it, from a number of sources that about Stan's role in the Czech Spring when he was in Czechoslovakia and how LSD played a part in the revolution over there and how his connection to Václav Havel and all worked out on the ground, which is, in terms of a countercultural experience, I mean, you don't get more cutting edge than that.
Talk to me about that for a moment. What was Stan Grof's role in the Prague Spring, if that is true?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'd have to slightly walk on eggshells because it's things that I've read in places and I've been told by people. Basically, the first generation of revolutionaries, I think a lot of them, Sprova in Czechoslovakia was making extremely good LSD very early, but also Stan was working with therapeutically with Sandoz LSD very early as well, and he was throwing is the wrong word, but he was organizing LSD sessions with the cutting edge of the young political thinkers and the avant-garde artists in Czechoslovakia, in Prague. And I think that there is a suggestion that revolutionary impulse in Czechoslovakia had some part to do with his behind the scenes work, essentially. And I think one only has to look at how when Václav Havel, who was Frank Zappa's friend and pal, became the president, one of the first things that happened was that Stan is awarded an honor and made a kind of an honorary citizen. So I think that speaks volumes. But I think that that revolutionary aspect, and certainly in his first psychedelic experiences, are very much about how this has a transformative experience and how it changes your engagement with society and culture. And very much he focuses more broadly, generally on therapy, but there's always that element that this is something that transforms people and that transforms people's engagement with reality. So and in a revolutionary way, in the sense of building a new society. So
one thing that I found very interesting going through your book was this focus on schools of psychotherapy. And for you, it was crucial that Stan Grof, in fact, was a psychoanalyst to begin with. Can you speak a little bit about why it was important that psychoanalysis was sort of the base upon which the LSD psychotherapy was placed?
Right. Well, I mean, you've really cut to the absolute center of the situation there with LSD psychotherapy, which is that although some of the earliest obviously came through psychiatry. So there's a distinction there between psychiatry, which treats the mental health situation as something that can be ameliorated by the use of drugs, and then psychotherapy, which treats it as being helped through the psychodynamic situation, through therapy and through essentially conversation. Although the earliest vanguard, the likes of Humphrey Osmond, for instance, were psychiatrists, I think really the key intervention came when psychotherapists realized that LSD could be used as a tool to basically expedite the therapeutic process. And you can cut in much deeper, much quicker, get through, ab reaction, form, work out what the complexes are, and to basically, cut to the heart of the matter much more quickly. It was essentially the Jungian therapists. So in the UK, the likes of Sanderson, who was a very early proponent of that position, but obviously in the most iconic way, Stan Grof, who saw the potential of psychedelics in therapy.
You talk about LSD's transition from the clinical setting to a force in society at large. And actually, you say it has much to do with the Beats and Allen Ginsberg. Talk to me about that.
I think that Ginsberg, probably more than anyone, appointed himself the cheerleader for LSD. I mean, obviously, Leary had a role, but it was really through being magnetized by Ginsberg. I mean, Ginsberg was one of the very earliest, I think he had in Menlo Park in part of the military program. Like Kesey in a way, who also had it very early, but Ginsberg just got everywhere and was just a fabulous cheerleader. And he had this reputation through the Beats already of a kind of, being this attractive revolutionary. And I think more than anybody, he galvanized the student populations, made it hip, basically. He attached it to, concepts that were in the air. So he really strengthened the relationship or the understanding of it in relation to Eastern philosophy. So, for instance, when Ginsberg visits the Dalai Lama, his question essentially is, he wanted to know about the use of psychedelics by Tibetan monks. Right the way through his experiences with Buddhism, he maintains the value for him of psychedelics. Even with Trungpa, when he's hanging out with Trungpa in Naropa, he's still singing the praises and beating the drum.
Right. So there was an interesting part of your book when you were talking about sort of, I don't know if I'm going to mangle what you wrote, but you said that the counterculture began with Ginsberg, perhaps in the mid-50s, or the hippies. Yes, the hippies began with Ginsberg in the mid-50s, and then ended in the mid-70s when he was taken off of Bob Dylan's Rolling Thunder bus. I was wondering if you could just sort of speak to that for a quick second.
Well, looking at the whole thing of the era of the counterculture, I mean, it's generally segmented into two halves of the Beat era and the hippie era. But really, there's so much collusion, and the same characters appear through the continuum. And for instance, Ginsberg is someone who is as much as important to the hippies as he is to the beatniks. So, when looking, obviously, when you talk about the counterculture, there's a temptation of really knowing when to start. I mean, Are You Serious? His book on the counterculture, he talks about Abraham, the prophet Abraham, to Acid House. So it's really like, where do you draw a meaningful line about when the counterculture starts and when it ends? And for me, Ginsberg reading Howl in I think it's 1956, and then to the Rolling Thunder tour, which is really where what happened was that he was brought on the tour to read Howl basically, and then I think Ginsberg Dylan I think got fed up with him a bit, and then he was demoted to a baggage handler. And I think that's the arc of this kind of excitement and fascination with those ideas. And as well, I think it gives an indication of how the music scene essentially swallowed all those ideas and impetuses, and in a way capitalized them to some degree. But for instance, one can view the Grateful Dead as a vehicle for the counterculture. It's like, where did it all go? Well, it went in a number of places. I mean, where it mainly went was rock music, but it also went into science fiction, and also it went a little bit into marketing, bizarrely. But the big one was rock music. And so that moment where he's ejected off the Rolling Thunder tours, it's quite a neat sort of like beginning and end for the book.
I like how you're bringing it back to the Grateful Dead. My wife and I are just watching this documentary that's on Amazon about the Grateful Dead. I think it's called Long Strange Trip. I'm a huge Deadhead, or used to be. I mean, for 5 years of my life, I only listened to the Grateful Dead. And I was always fascinated to learn that they had been the house band for Ken Kesey's acid tests, and also to learn that they had kind of met in Menlo Park. So I want to ask you about these early days in Menlo Park. Why the hell was Menlo Park the epicenter of some psychedelic revolution, including, you mentioned Ken Kesey. And Ken Kesey had been, in your book you write that in 1959, he was volunteering for these LSD experiments through the Veterans Hospital in Menlo Park.
He was encouraged by a friend to go along, and he was paid to take LSD, obviously, like was kind of common in those days, and just had the most overwhelming experience. I think one of the things as well that happened to Kesey was that they used the strobe light on him. So, and this is one of the kind of the motifs of the early LSD psychiatric research was, I think they would wheel out the strobe, and it's certainly something that happened to Stan Grof as well. And I think it intensifies the hallucinations to a great degree. I think there's literally the sensation that things are pouring out of the light itself.
You write in the book that there was a connection between the tests that he was taking, being paid for in Menlo Park at the Veterans Hospital, and the CIA program MK Ultra. For those of us who are not familiar with MK Ultra, can you sort of shed some light on that?
When LSD first became, available, it was so remarkably powerful that many different organizations scratched their head to figure out how this was going to be useful. I mean, Grof, one of the reasons why Grof twigged on LSD psychotherapy was that the vial that came to arrive to him with Sandoz had a note with it which suggested that it could be possibly used in psychotherapy. But for instance, the military also were fascinated by the idea of there being some use to it. And obviously the first things that they assumed that it was going to be useful for were what's described as the Manchurian candidate. There was a real fear and distrust about how a lot of high-profile American spies were being made to spill their secrets to the Chinese, and so there was a kind of Cold War era race to develop a substance that was going to be able to allow American troops or American military to find out people to basically shed the secrets without being sort of killed or maimed in torture. So that was the first stage. But then what happened was that didn't really work terribly well. And so in the same way that, for instance, that Humphrey Osmond first started out thinking about psychedelics as psychotomimetics, as in ways in which the schizophrenic experience could be modeled for people who hadn't experienced schizophrenia, and then moved to thinking maybe it could be used for alcoholics. The army, in the same way, rooted around and thought, okay, well, it's not working for this, but it's so powerful, we've got to be able to use it for something. And so MK Ultra, which I know is explored in John Ronson's book, The Men Who Stare at Goats, was the idea that you would could be a remote operative. So you would be able to take LSD and you'd be able to predict the location of a missile strike. So it's quite remarkable because it really buys into the mystic properties of LSD and the assumptions of what are possible under psychedelics. I mean, you hear a lot in primitive cultures about people taking mushrooms and then as a tool for finding lost sheep and things like that. But this is like the exact analogy of that, where it's like we can use these drugs to read minds on remote and do telepathic messaging and all that. So MK Ultra was the full crazy.
I love the MK Ultra tale. It's so perfect for LSD, because LSD is, and psychedelics in general, are these so-called ego-dissolving substances. They're magic. They're magic in that way because they take us out of our, horribly regimented human, just awful hunter-gathering, murdering type of people, and break us into these peaceful, bizarre beings, right? And then there's this desire by people who are not on the psychedelics, who are still operating within the confines of this ego-bound identity, to say, how can we weaponize this? How can we make this? How can we harness this magic that is bound to disempower us? How can we use it to empower us further? This is a wonderful little fable.
But there's this sort of there's dissenting views certainly in the counterculture. I mean, for instance, Burroughs, his theory at the time was that the LSD was being introduced by the government to make the young people more pliant and able to deal with, So as much as we can appreciate the how these substances work to dismantle society. I mean, there were voices that were saying, well, actually, and Burroughs, the example he gave was of how the CIA were using the bodies of dead servicemen in Vietnam to ship opiates into the ghettos of America. So he said they're capable of that. They're capable of giving us LSD to make us peaceful. So who knows what was going on?
Yeah, one thing I really enjoy about your book is how you sort of had everybody weigh in. You read about Burroughs. Burroughs was no fan of LSD, isn't that correct?
That's right. And he wrote very scabrously about it. He didn't think it was anything. He was contemptuous of Ginsberg, and Kerouac as well was disliked the psilocybin experience. Kerouac's had this kind of gnomic quote, which was that walking on water wasn't built in a day, which is what he used to try to shut down the irrepressible Leary. But no, yeah, I mean, I think it's I've tried to, certainly currently we live in an era of tremendous optimism about psychedelics, and I certainly share a lot of those optimisms, but it does remind me, having surveyed the history of us being slightly similar to about 1963 in a kind of a repeating cycle. I hope that it all works out better this time, and certainly the work that MAPS are doing, for instance. I think that there's a very good chance, certainly with MDMA, that we'll have a situation where we can actually keep using these substances constructively, but going through the whole rise and fall of the whole thing, and seeing studying the lives of the casualties and seeing all the good and the bad, you certainly you hope that it's going to work out better this time for everybody.
Yeah, and I assume that you're talking about sort of like the Timothy Leary led democratization of psychedelics, widely put out into the culture, including young people who weren't ready for it, as well as people with psyches that were disposed to schizophrenic tendencies, et cetera, all the people who could have started off on a sort of neutral level with psychedelics, but then they were fed all of the fear from the media, that thus inducing the negative trips and whatnot. Right. Kind of turned into a real shitstorm. That's
right, and I think that and even as something as basic as set and setting. The set and setting was, that's Kesey's whole strategy, was to completely upturn set and setting. That's what the acid tests were about, was let's just freak everybody out instead of creating and nurturing environments. Let's just freak the hell out of everybody. But as well, I think in terms of that era, and certainly against the background of the Haight-Ashbury, I think that there was a problem in that it was all the rebellious and also disturbed people from right across the States, people escaping very difficult family backgrounds, coming as young impressionable people to San Francisco, unhealthy, malnutrition often, people with kwashiorkor, and then that feeding into, it's obvious that there's going to be a maelstrom, and I guess something like Altman is the end game for that particular scene. So I'm optimistic, but hopefully.
I feel optimistic as well. And, we happen to be really lucky with the current insane administration that's leading the government of the United States, that for some reason they have no problem with the advancing legal status of MDMA therapy for PTSD. The Food and Drug Administration of the United States has been remarkably progressive. I don't understand it myself, but I'm okay with it. I wanted to ask you to talk about, I want to hear you talk about a little bit about the Harvard psilocybin project, because I don't think everybody knows about it, and its subsequent sabotage by Andrew Weil, which definitely not everyone knows about. So speak about that for a moment.
Sure. Well, firstly, Leary got a place at Harvard. He was brought on as an assistant professor, which was an extremely, obviously, prestigious position to be in. I can't think that someone of his, his CV before that is completely wild. And he was always an incredible troublemaker. And I think nowadays that's the sort of thing that he probably wouldn't slip through the system. And once there, the two of them, Richard Alpert and him, basically managed to turn on the undergraduates, and firstly by the route of getting people to volunteer, to take part in psilocybin trials, and then but I think what happened was that the excitement and the sort of, there was a building momentum. And I think very quickly became that students were dropping out and going to sit on the banks of the Ganges and write to their parents telling them that they'd found God, and they were leaving the university. And I think the whole fabric of the trials got basically way out of hand. And I think there was also, I think, competition between students to be in the clique. Behind all of this is in the outset was Aldous Huxley, who was strongly encouraging Leary to take on basically the brightest and the best. I think that was the original idea for Aldous Huxley's idea. Certainly was to turn on the elite, which I think they obviously was what they were doing at Harvard. But when Ginsberg visited them, his view was this is too good for the elite, and I think Leary used his position at Harvard to go and approach and involve other people and to spread it basically in a way that if he didn't have that respectability, or he wouldn't have been able to do. What happened was that Andrew Weil wrote a paper for the Harvard Crimson, which was the university newspaper, basically exposing what was going on, and actually Leary resigned. He was fed up with it anyway, and in a sense that his preoccupation went from a medical preoccupation of being a doctor to a consciousness preoccupation. So he set up the League for Spiritual Discovery, and he was only really enabled to do that by the moment he left Harvard. But I think Alpert stayed there and kept going on until I think he was actually thrown out of Harvard. But it was Weil's article, Andrew Weil's article, who's obviously now a very famous and respected wellness guru with kind of an industry behind him. But I think he regrets it. I know that it's something that he has regrets over. With LSD, it was almost like it seemed that there was always somebody who was more responsible than everybody else, and so you have Stanley Cohen, who's criticizing Hoffer and Osmond, and then Hoffer and Osmond are criticizing Leary for being even more responsible than them, and then Leary's criticizing Ken Kesey for being even more responsible than him. So there's always a kind of there's always someone who's doing it even more wrongly than they are. So it's but the thing that Humphrey Osmond and Abraham Hoffer in their book Hallucinogens, there's a great thing in the introduction, which is that they having basically lost their entire, or they were just about to lose their entire research career and their static tenures at Sasquatch and their safe jobs. One of the things they said, almost I think aware of the chaos that Leary caused, was that one thing that's not going to happen as a result of all of this kerfuffle is that no one's going to forget LSD, and that certainly has been true. It was a major blip in the, Grof laments 50 years of lost research, but no one was ever going to forget LSD as a result. It was a huge advertising campaign in a sense.
To me, the whole connection with Andrew Weil is interesting. He also has a significant connection with the Esalen Institute in the 1980s, who was there, 70s, 80s, who was there all the time doing lots of his writing, given many speeches on all drugs, on psychedelics, and he comes out as pro-psychedelic, at least in the material that I've listened to from the 1980s, which was recorded at the Esalen Institute at some point. One thing I just love about your book is this, as I alluded to earlier, is it's almost like an encyclopedia of all the who's of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and there's a part in there about one of my favorite writers, Tom Wolfe. He's weirdly conservative.
Yes.
I didn't understand that. I learned about the project of the 60s through the electric Kool-Aid acid test. He became one of my favorite authors. He has this exciting, and I would say democratic prose style. He was all about liberating the voice of the author, the voice of the journalist, from some boring, mundane, sort of observational recording style into this person with opinions and verve and personality. And it was only much later that I understood his anti-liberal tendencies, which were made manifest, of course, in Radical Chic, and then later in the Me Decade, where he writes about Est and he writes about Esalen. So what are your thoughts about Wolfe?
Well, there's a very funny anecdote where he later on, I think he visits Kesey at his farm, and he's wearing a blazer. They're trying to paint a fence or something, and they ask him if he would hold the paint pot or something, and he gets paint on his jacket, and they're like, do you know what I mean? And so I think there is that thing of, there is definitely a current in the, and I didn't say, there's a lot of socialism in the book, and certainly the Freudian Marxists, so Norman O'Brien and Herbert Marcuse are very important characters in the book. But as well, there is an aspect of that era, which is the kind of libertarian streak, whereby that there is kind of a room there for some right-wing elements, and I guess we have to acknowledge, that some aspect of their project, has the more anarchic, freewheeling aspects of it, have something to be said for them, I suppose. And so I think Tom Wolfe comes from that kind of, certainly in the 60s, I would imagine he was kind of a reconstructed Republican in a sense. There is that thing, and obviously the 80s, a lot of those figures switched quite comfortably into sort of right-wing positions. So it's a complex story. I think that Wolfe does Esalen a terrible disservice. Actually, I think with the Kool-Aid acid test, he's in the mix. He's following Kesey around. He's involved. He's actually living it. He wasn't, as far as I was aware, he wasn't doing LSD, but he's in the flow with everybody else, and But I think when it comes to the Me Decade, which is which is this famous article that you alluded to, I think he's probably not on the cutting edge any longer, and I don't think he has the grasp or the understanding of the full philosophical ideas that lay behind, for instance, the Esalen project, and so I don't think he does it any justice, and Thomas Lash is exactly the same. They don't understand. There are early, it actually picks up from earlier critiques of Esalen were actually written from within Esalen. So I think Sam Keane, who was one of the was a research assistant at that stage, he wrote a very early article on how meditation, how can we meditate in a world in which there is Biafra, which was the kind of the I think it was the Nigerian situation. And I think that to some degree, certainly, I think it looks like, certainly against the background of what Grof was doing with the spiritual emergency, which was kind of like a call center for people having difficult psychotic experiences which bordered on the psychedelic. I think there was a sense that Esalen had picked up that critique and had worked with it, but Tom Wolfe comes and he doesn't really understand the idea of nowness as it was being used. He doesn't understand the Tao. He doesn't understand. So, for instance, like Theodore Roszak, who wrote extensively on the counterculture, he actually understands. He actually reads about and he understands the those currents, the Buddhism and the Vedanta, but Wolfe doesn't, and he just is a very knee-jerk critique, almost groundless. And then Lasch comes on after Tom Wolfe. It's almost like there's almost a sense of like, it's a sort of book deal. Oh, here we go. Here's an idea that's out there. Let's run with it. And I think that the culture was ready for it at that stage. And it's the era of Dirty Harry, and also the era of The Shining, when all those ideas that were originally exciting and revolutionary and transformative that came out of the 60s was suddenly like terrifying and threatening, and the dangers of mental health. And so I think they came at that era and they rode with it. So I think at that stage, I think Tom Wolfe is just he's going with it. He's no longer on the understanding.
Yeah, a couple of things to unpack from what you were saying. You talked about this Marcuse and another person who were part of the Freudian Marxists. Now, what I assume
Norman O'Brien. Yeah,
Norman O'Brien. So, what about the counterculture is underpinned by the thinkings of the Freudian Marxists?
Well, the Freudian Marxist was the dominant thinking, the dominant philosophical thinking of the era, in the sense that, Marcuse was like a college darling. He actually was. He went and talked to everybody. He was very open. So not only was the culture ready for him, but also he was willing to go out and talk. And obviously, they were very involved in the New Left, but also they were very involved in the same preoccupations that was fascinating the counterculture, since they were very much involved in the psychiatric ideas. Marcuse went to the Roundhouse and took part in the Dialectics of Liberation conference in London, which was like the kind of hippie central, the big powwow when all the brothers came and talked about their ideas. They were fashionable, but Norman O'Brien Jim Morrison was reading Norman O'Brien, so they were part of the mix, basically.
I guess I'm asking why Marxism in general was interesting within the context of the counterculture, because I think about it today, and there is a significant counterculture probably within the United States and most sort of like countries, right? But hardly anybody is bringing up Marx.
That's right. Well, over here we have socialism. I think that with Bernie Sanders, you have something reasonably close. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the counterculture, the best way to distill it is there's a brilliant Norman O'Brien quote where he says that the ego is the first private property, and so there's this idea that the whole drive of the whole culture, from LSD through all the different techniques of meditation, the way that yoga was used, flotation tanks, everything is all directed to this thing of ego dissolution. And at this point, these theorists, they're quintessentially theorists of the self, of this kind of ego dissolution. And what they were entranced by with Freud, most especially, was the idea of liberation and sexual liberation. Their reading of Freud was very much about the possibilities that Freud laid open. The big thing for Norman O'Brien was what was called polymorphous perversity. The idea was, Freud's idea was that sexuality became genital, that when you start as a child, your whole engagement with reality is erotic. But through the process of society's inculcation of you, all that wonderful stuff is basically drawn down into your genital experience. And that was the big thing, certainly for 60s feminism, for studies of the female orgasm, and obviously for how that relates to Wilhelm Reich. But there was this big drive, essentially, that Marcuse and Norman O'Brien represent, which is this fleeing to, or this dissolution of the ego. I actually view in the book Esalen as being, you only have to watch the videos. There's a wonderful video I watched today of everybody at Esalen, which documents, the time, the activities at Esalen. And there's a lot of people cooking in the kitchens and working in the gardens. There's a very much an integrative, which is in the best sense, a kind of an ego-focused, a kind of healthy ego that Esalen represents. And I always see this as why Esalen survived where the counterculture burnt up, because the whole impulse of the counterculture is this kind of explosive dissolution of ego. And what happens is a kind of Icarus-like situation. Whereas I think Esalen has worked over the years on a more integrated, Jungian in the truest sense, method of aligning, with those higher ideas, rather than just being completely swallowed up by them. So
I would offer too that part of the reason that Esalen survived is because their leadership was so decidedly unguru-esque. You have this line in your book, the male gurus who lorded over the counterculture: Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, Chogyam Trungpa, Muktananda, Rajneesh, Sachinanda, and even Bhagavan Das. They all abused their position and manipulated their pupils for sex. Now, with the Esalen Institute, you have Michael Murphy, basically mostly interested in meditating and intellectual ideas. And then you have Dick Price, who was just a very solid person, extremely interested in Gestalt therapy, extremely interested in the Gestalt of nature. There's never been a story about either of these men not only abusing their power in order to gain sex or to gain some sort of followers, but there's not been stories of any kind of, that personal vindictiveness that comes from misuse of power. So Esalen, in a certain sense, was quite lucky in that way. But yeah, talk a little bit more about the Esalen Institute and why it was important enough to get a chapter within your book about counterculture.
Well, it's one of the very few kind of global power centers, as I kind of imagine it in my mind. It sits very comfortably within the narrative. One of the I think Jeffrey Kripal who's wrote the kind of the definitive biography of Esalen. He points out that it's different from the counterculture, and I definitely agree with that. But it's almost like it's come from the same roots, the same preoccupations. You don't have to see the relation of Aldous Huxley to it, or Alan Watts, or any of those key foundational figures. But then it doesn't. It's almost like in some situations it seems like it's a canvas where countercultural events play out. So we have kind of incursions from Manson and the Kesey visiting with the Merry Pranksters, or Leary showing up. And I think in a way it's a very, I think it's very nice. It's a very nice example of how those ideas can actually thrive, rather than in a sense of someone like, there is an aspect of the book where I do talk about the catastrophes of the counterculture, and it's quite amusing. There's an amusing aspect to it, which is, you see the disaster that these the situations that happen, and the Haight-Ashbury and Altamont, and there is a kind of a fascinating, and with Manson there is a hilarious and fascinating tragedy, but to the excess. But Esalen seems to manage to work through the same load, but do it in a way that it has still survived.
I love that quote that you unfurled for us several minutes ago. But would you say that again about the?
Was it the Norman O'Brien? The ego is the first private property.
I think that's it. I think that's it, and that's just so. That's fucking brilliant. Yeah. The ego is the first private property, because this question of ego is just so central to the project of the counterculture, and the project of the counterculture is so central to any discussion that we have about mainstream culture in general.
And I gave a talk to the Psychedelic Society of what we can learn from that era, and I think if we can learn from that sort of pinnacle ascent of the Himalayas of consciousness, that whole fabric of that whole era and all the interlocking disciplines, and if we can learn from the mistakes that they made, then hopefully we can make some progress. We can get up onto that high plateau that Abraham Maslow talked about.
Mm-hmm. Matthew Ingram, thanks for joining us today on Voices of Esalen. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Terry Gilby, Michelle McCrary, Michelle Broderick, and Tanya Ruse. Our music is by Nico Holloman. The Esalen Institute is a nonprofit organization. Our show is made possible by your contributions.